The New York Times bestseller lists this year convey a sense of being adrift in technological America, and this is true in both the nonfiction and the fiction categories. Among the former is Future Shock, Alvin Toffler's ambivalent treatise on the West's transition from an industrial to a super-industrial age. The book causes a sensation in the United States, to an extent at least that a work of cultural commentary can do so, and coins or popularizes a number of key terms. Thus, the Sunday talk shows and discussion salons are now abuzz with mention of the information age, this post-war epoch in which the exchange of data has supplanted agricultural and manufacturing pursuits as humanity's main endeavor. Toffler's other two main catchphrases, information overload and, of course, future shock, not so much suggest as directly reference a new malady of mind as technology continues to pervade society. In fiction, we have Being There, Jerzy Kosinski's novel about an involuted man-child who stumbles into fame after a reclusive multimillionaire takes him in on charity as a pet project and then passes away, leaving the man to fend for himself. Lacking even the most basic formal education or social cultivation, Chauncey Gardner is instead raised by television, much the way the enfant terrible is raised by wolves. He's like a shape in flatland who's never been lifted from the plane of his existence, a plane that resembles a wobbling movie canvas. So entrained is Chauncey by the TV screen that his quasi-schizophrenic thoughts indicate less a coherent, self-actualized consciousness than a fluid soul, adrift in mass media. By changing channels, he observes of his own reality, he could change himself, a notion too easily misinterpreted as indicating Chauncey has been subsumed completely in the river-like flow of TV's programming. He has instead become a kind of circuit with television, one that gives him more control over his being, not less. He selects the channel, and in return the television alters him to better suit his liking. He's not quite an autonomous human subject, yes, in that he's influenced by a hypnotic influencing device, but he also has control of that device. As this example might indicate, Being There hovers uneasily between polemic and meditation. Is Chauncey really devoured by television, or are he and it in a more complicated, maybe even symbiotic relationship? Kosinski ridicules the idea that television has an educational or edifying dimension. Despite years spent consuming it, Chauncey can neither read nor write. On the other hand, Chauncey also has a cherubic quality. As a team of publicists and opportunists reincorporates him into society and cook up ever more ambitious schemes to cash in on his fame, he reflects on their manipulations in a way that indicates he recognizes them without resenting them. Take, for instance, his reaction when one of his handlers abbreviates his name to Chance, figuring this will travel better over the airwaves. He notices the change, but assumes that, as on TV, he must use his new name from now on. Here he's referring to the practice, defamiliarized in Chauncey's perspective, via the uninitiated nature of his social consciousness, of actors adopting stage names to weave effective fiction. Rather than embodying regression into a more primitive state, as the enfant terrible or the beast from The Mad Monster does, Chance instead embodies an ambivalent evolution. He's more developed in some ways, less so in others, as though 2001: A Space Odyssey's Starchild had drifted down to Earth and grown up. For this reason, critics who overemphasize the archness of Kosinski's invective in Being There are missing much of his point. He isn't railing against television or calling for its regulation, lest we all become wayward and media-damaged like Chauncey. Television's here to stay, and we're destined to become whatever it's turning us into. The only trick is figuring out, anticipating what that's likely to be. The curiously obligatory quality of screens, television and otherwise, is starting to be noticed elsewhere in popular consciousness. In one of the year's big-budget war epics, Tora Tora Tora, screens similarly capture the gaze, but as this film is a throwback to the more primitive technology of an earlier time, the gaze isn't captivated so much as coerced. Screens in those days weren't as interesting, which is to say that the operators monitoring a Hawaii radar installation for signs of imminent air attack in the beginning of the movie are doing so not because it has won their attention, but because they're under orders.
You two stay put and keep watching that screen. In 2 hours, close down. I'll send a truck back to pick you up.
Excuse me, sir, but what are we watching for?
Conventional wisdom in 1970 America holds that World War II was won through a combination of national character, abundant resources, and second-to-none logistics. This last isn't as sexy as the first two, but you hear about it all the time. The organizational gift the United States showed for moving a sprawling war apparatus across 2 of the 7 seas. The popular culture of the late 60s has led us as Americans to this not intolerable place. We remember ourselves as the sole architects of victory in this century's key conflict. We as Americans are astride the world, not so much due to our industry. The Russians, it turns out, are roughly as good at that, but because of our agility at sending things from place to place, almost invariably across broad bodies of water. Our status as most protected land mass on the globe, the continental United States, are unique in being bounded on the east and west by oceans, and on the north and south by an unthreatening and a river-bounded border, respectively, has long afforded us a geographical advantage, one unprecedented in the short history of consciousness on Earth. America was the modern world's unilateral power throughout the last decade, and has been, in fact, since the end of World War II. Its recent resounding victory in the space race has only solidified this status. So long as further calamity in Vietnam can be averted, the upcoming decade looks to be just as Amerocentric as the last. Hollywood glows with pride at this achievement. George C. Scott, playing George Patton in 1970's Best Picture contender, praises the general's skill at the tabletop task of authoring and winning a military campaign, though Scott spends maybe as much time interrogating Patton's obligatory and perverse love of war. MASH comes out the same year, and one feels an ideological line of scrimmage being drawn between 2 camps as the Vietnam conflict drags on. One, summed up in Scott's performance, has fixed with longing on an idealized legacy, the great victories of mid-century. The other, courtesy of the wisecracking staff of the 407 7th, meets war with the resigned sadness and contemplates abstractions like victory and heroism with wry detachment. National pride in the American military is exaggerated because it's under threat, because Vietnam's turning out less like a replay of the Pacific Campaign and more like one among a string of failed colonial enterprises. The Battle of Algiers chronicles the quagmire that engulfed the French occupiers in Algeria. Aside from this, the British suffered humiliation in the Suez Canal and lost their imperial presence in India. Then, of course, there's the bloody defeat at Dien Bien Phu. Nostalgia for imperial projects has swelled so because the legitimacy of such projects is looking more and more dubious. Film favors armed conflict as a subject because of its grotesque visual spectacle, yes, but also because of its tendency to echo narrative structure. There's a rising action, the military buildup or marshalling of field resources. The crisis follows, leading to a climax, the battle, crystallizing in a win or a rout. All that remains is the aftermath, the falling action, and all that matters here is that the ending be the happy one of victory. The language beamed back from the industrial killing effort in Vietnam echoes all this. Once more, the nation's military machine has been shipped across an ocean at great expense, and once more the battles are shaped as narratives. Search and Destroy, or Sweep and Clear, if you prefer, mirrors the first act and the second, the reconnaissance and the battle. The happy ending here is presumed. The third, the mop-up, closes the curtain. With this, the whole enterprise advances, and the play is staged again a little closer to Hanoi.
John Wayne!
The story is there, but this time the logistics aren't following. Though they do so at great cost, the North Vietnamese flummox the American war machine, with its penchant for static fronts. The Americans are accustomed to facing generally matched industrial powers. The asymmetrical and guerrilla tactics of the North Vietnamese confound Western warfighters. Desperate to reverse the war's momentum, the U.S. military chews through the agrarian cultures of Southeast Asia like a thresher. In the 5 years since the murky Gulf of Tonkin incident, hundreds of thousands of innocents, probably 1 million or more, have died in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This carnage hasn't translated into progress in strategic terms, moreover. The spell the United States cast in World War II isn't magic anymore. That is, assuming victory is the government's intention, which is an assumption the mass media generally make. Perhaps the nation can get back to its logistical expertise by turning introspective. 2 years earlier, Arthur Haley's best-selling novel Airport achieved its success by translating the complexities of war into a civilian milieu. This March, George Seaton's movie adaptation does much the same. As with the later Tora, 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 there's an infatuation with tactics and logistics, right down to the endless talk of keeping runways cleared. As with Patton's European front, Airport's Great Lakes region is kept running smoothly by ego combined with legitimate competence, namely Mel Bakersfield's. A general manager, Mel smoothly negotiates various challenges from the wood-paneled head office of Chicago's Lincoln International Airport. The problems he encounters are not only numerous but diverse. Security issues. A stowaway gifted at gaming the human element cons about a dozen stewardesses, security hands, and cashiers into a free flight from New York. Local imbroglios. Low-flying takeoffs over Meadowwood upset its well-to-do residents and the board of directors in turn. And, naturally, logical conundrums. Mainly that of the jackknifed Boeing 707 wobbling half-on, half-off runway 39er due to the 7 inches of snow that have fallen in the last day. Nuts! The military comparisons aren't all implicit. The novel and movie share an infatuation with the 747, which had its debut commercial flight between the two. But the book goes on to mention a successor to the jumbo jet, one that never saw commercial release. A civilian adaptation of the Air Force's C-5A cargo plane. It was to seat 1,000 passengers. War presents potential futures as it reinscribes static pasts. Mel soldiers through an undisclosed injury suffered in Korea, one that requires him to delegate the more physical maintenance tasks to his Patton-esque sidekick, the cigar-chomping Joe Patroni. When his brother-in-law Vernon Demarest scolds him for an over-reliance on facts and figures,
sitting behind that desk made you think like a bookkeeper.
He seems at first to be after him about his age. Dean Martin's a mere 4 years younger than Burt Lancaster, though, so one actually detects a dig at the sedentary lifestyle brought on by Mel's injury here.
You always fly a desk. Well, all right, Daddy. Now you tell me all about when you were a war hero. You flew those pursuit jobs you could land in a parking lot. When I'm setting down over 200,000 pounds of 707, I want something under my wheels that's plenty long and mighty dry.
It'll be dry tonight, but not too long.
One of Mel's many rivals, Vernon calls him a quarter cripple. Elsewhere, Mel stumbles, and Tanya, his second-in-command, must support him by the arm. The two trade not a word about his moment of frailty. As usual, war's legacy is repressed, mired in icy subtext.
September sees the birth of Airport's little brother, San Francisco International Airport, episode 614. This NBC pilot, pardon the pun, takes all the original's explosive drama and shifts it into the realm of hypothesis. I mean this literally. The movie opens with American 111 in crisis, its knock-kneed landing gear liable to crumple when it touches down at SFO. 111's delegation of congressmen bite their pillows and brace for impact, only to experience an uneventful touchdown followed by a smug security chief explaining that the crisis was just a routine simulation.
On the appropriations that the Airport Commission is asking for,
he says by way of a tangent.
Remember what it was like up there a little while.
A writer's miscalculation. We're meant to take Chief Conrad's deception as a heroic gambit in the interest of saving lives, but it comes off like a mock execution meant to squeeze the legislators for money. So, too, at the end, when the MacGuffin, a bomb in the earlier film, is rendered inert. Here, the contraband is a harmless $3 million in cash, pilfered from another plane's belly while it's still on the tarmac. Given the time frame involved, Airport and San Francisco International are released 7 months apart. The latter movie is more likely an imitation of Arthur Haley's novel. It varies from both, but in a way that retains much. In no case does the airport manager steal the show. That role invariably falls to the sidekick, the aforementioned George Kennedy, or later, Clu Gulager. The translation gives NBC's movie a whole different valence. Clu plays Bob Hatton, head of security, where Joe Petroni is a maintenance chief. Thus, where Mel Bakersfield's problems are solved through holistic thinking, Chief Conrad uses more specialized knowledge. Maintenance and management have a more lubricated, professional relationship. They dovetail. Maintenance is the art of making matters run smoothly, and management is the art of making people work smoothly. Management and security, though, run at cross purposes. Maintenance fixes what's broken. It feeds the system. Security sends stress up the chain, and so drains the system. An alert goes out that someone has crossed a border with a contraband item. The item may be intercepted, the duties and fines paid, but the message has a corrosive consequence in itself. The act of interdiction fortifies borders, yes, but it also reminds us of their vulnerability, their potential porousness. For this reason, Airport casts its characters as heroes in a great struggle against outrageous fortune, whereas San Francisco's seem more like architects of their own troubles. Do you imagine Chief Conrad has helped get his desired legislative outcome by making the congressmen on Flight 111 panic for their lives? Has Hatton helped by excusing Conrad's conduct, as he does later, on the grounds that he's gotten no formal complaints about it? Airport has a security guy, too. He's actually a customs man, but he also serves, in the movie at least, as the airport's guardian, its surveillance instrument.
First I look in their eyes and then the luggage.
He explains as he busts a wealthy woman for trying to sneak jewels into the country without paying import duty. To be fair, her tells are pretty obvious, what with the imitation Bergdorf Goodman bag and the dodgy demeanor typical of a would-be smuggler. The point seems here to be more that Harvey Standish is adroit at detecting signs of moral trespass than that he has great powers of perception. He doesn't assume Mrs. Mossman to be a thief because of her ostentatious and apparently unearned wealth, but he doesn't overcompensate and assume his suspicions are merely a matter of his own prejudice either. He only looks for the crime and finds it by seeing the willingness in the suspect's eyes to commit it. Since its management lacks this moral compass, SFO is, unlike Lincoln, rife with criminality. The biggest criminal act in Airport, which admittedly is not insignificant, a despairing ex-construction worker sneaks a bomb onto a plane to get life insurance money for his wife, is nearly ferreted out by Standish, who spies the bomber at the boarding gate, nervously clutching his bag to his chest. San Francisco's main hub is instead riddled with conspirators and gun-wielding thugs, one of whom holds a woman for ransom in plain sight on the tarmac. Hatton only diffuses the situation by gambling with her life. He drives out to the runway to get a better look, and the gunman tells him through an intermediary that he'll shoot the hostage if he doesn't back off. "You tell him we're not moving," Hatton tells the intermediary, bargaining with the woman's life as the pot, that the gunman doesn't mean what he says. "You tell him he's calling the shots." Their organization is so lax that a boy set off by the news that his parents are getting a divorce is later set to wander among the parked aircraft, where he commandeers a private plane, launches it, and nearly kills himself. The airport in Airport is barely holding itself together. The airport in San Francisco International is actively coming apart. As riffs on the ongoing police action in Vietnam, where it is and where it's going, respectively, these twin cinematic outings could scarcely be more apt. As for the war's cultural effect domestically in the United States, well, these movies seem to have a message about that, too. The president, this year running for a second term, has managed to put together a conservative constituency. This is no small accomplishment, considering the blow racial reform has so recently dealt to Southern conservatives as a political brand. He's done this mostly through appeals to the aerospace and oil industries, vital sources of jobs in Atlanta, Houston, and other regional hubs. Rather than play to conservatism's racist cultural roots, as Barry Goldwater and George Wallace did, Nixon instead advances the liberal agenda on several fronts, not only founding the EPA, but giving more money to the arts and humanities endowments and reaching out to labor unions. He's doing this as part of a cynical strategy to redirect the funding for these initiatives and thereby neuter his liberal political opponents, but no matter. The approach enables him to rack up victories by skillfully balancing his Southern cultural demographic with the more scientifically and socially progressive constituency of the new urban and suburban South. In the murky Everglades of the blood waters of Dr. Z, episode 1005, we see this emergent clash between the racism of the region's segregationist rural law enforcement institutions and its wealthy and relatively metropolitan centers of commerce. Dr. Z, writer-director Don Barton, balances these two cultural forces symbolically by pitting a likable black research intern against a podunk Florida sheriff. Rex and Lou, on the hunt for a terrifying man-fish gone berserk, certainly make an unlikely pair, but the contours of their broad caricatures align neatly with the two warring forces the Nixon administration is so deftly balancing. Rex stands in for the progressive science and reason-based contingent, the new money in the space-age Sunbelt. He's a young, highly skilled Afro-American man on track for a lucrative career in the marine sciences. The overweight sheriff, on the other hand, lolls about the station all day with his feet on the desk, blurting out patronizing deprecations drenched in racially charged overtones. One suspects he may be the beneficiary of nepotism. Up to now, the town under his casual protection has broadly supported him, but this is mainly because they share his regressive racial attitudes. Now that he's fallen to a professional arrangement with Rex, the folks' white supremacist animus, which has been propping him up, starts to put his job in jeopardy. As the fishman's rampage goes on and the police keep coming up with nothing, the angry townsfolk start gathering around the sheriff and demanding results. This culminates in an accusation directed at the sheriff of collaborating with a non-Anglo-Saxon culture. An accusation directed through arguably the ugliest word in English.
Some sheriff, yellow-bellied, and a damn nigger lover.
We overhear from the crowd. There can't be much doubt in Rex's mind now about the sort of people he's dealing with. There can be even less when the town, fed up, forms a mob to hunt down the creature vigilante style. The sheriff then essentially deputizes him, preferring to put up a pretense of law and order rather than try to honestly placate them back into the civil sphere, as the duties of his profession truly call for. If Don Barton takes pains to highlight the bigoted, volatile undercurrent in his fictional Florida town, he does so only to more clearly communicate his alignment with Rex and the forces of science and progress. We see this first in Gerald Cruz's charmingly earnest portrayal of Rex. Made on a limited budget as a kind of community effort, Dr. Z is cast largely with non-professional actors, and this is as apparent in Cruz's case as elsewhere. If such a thing can be said, though, Rex is easy to like, even if he isn't believable. He focuses unflappingly on the task at hand while gamely reciting the drab lines Barton's written.
Walking fish wasn't part of the curriculum. They didn't teach us how to be kind to sheriffs either, but I'm trying. You bet.
It's been 3 years, but horror fans are still buzzing about Dwayne Jones's performance as Ben in Night of the Living Dead. And though Cruz is a lesser talent than Jones, and Ben's a lot less personable than Rex, both signal an ongoing social transformation. More and more, the pragmatic and progressive culture of the city and suburb has won the favor of the public mind over the country, with its perceived legacy of ignorance and racism. This is evidenced both in Barton and George Romero's casting decision itself, and in the circumstance of the respective characters they've created. Open expressions of racist contempt in public forums were still broadly acceptable only a decade ago, and many quarters of society still grumble about imaginary problems like race mixing, so these filmmakers could expect some backlash. So too do Ben and Rex. Black and white audiences alike are asked to identify with these two Afro-American men as they struggle simply to move forward, set on from all sides by whites who either burden them with irrational outbursts or treat them with contempt. Moving forward in Rex's case means solving the mystery of the walking catfish plaguing the town and later the slew of murders that take place there. This is where social progressivism meets space program chic in the form of the International Phenomena Investigations Team. Called in to aid with the stymied investigations, NPIT is an ill-defined private organization devoted to issues on the cutting edge of research. Its closest real-life cousin is probably the Advanced Research Project Agency, which even now is quietly experimenting with something called ARPANET, a non-centralized computer network designed to survive a nuclear war. As Don Barton's means are more modest, he renders NPIT by fitting an RV with a few racks of oscillators and battery testers and painting a logo on the side that's better suited for a toy company than a top-flight scientific engineering venture. Operating it are Martha and Walker, a pair of technicians sporting snazzy jumpsuits and non-regulation haircuts. They openly mix business with pleasure, pausing their murder investigation time and again to flirt or make out. A few times in the second half of Dr. Z, the non-titular monster peers unnoticed at Martha and Walker in these private moments of loving repose. When this happens, one suspects there's more going on in the mind and the anatomically incorrect loins of the beast than simple prurient interest. It was human once, and in its human form, Dr. Leopold thought long and hard about it, the species, its drive to procreate, its vulnerabilities and hopes. Like the mad monster's Cameron, Leopold is hoping to avenge the shame heaped on him by former colleagues, but Leopold also means to subjugate the whole human race. His studies of Homo sapiens in its natural habitat are a function of this here and earlier, when, in search of a mate, he scopes out a bikini-clad woman at a swimming hole. Again, the monster's gaze is largely prurient, but not altogether. In Leopold's ambles around his dreary, isolated compound, he never makes contact with another person. So far as anyone knows, he's never felt a loving touch at all. On the symbolic level, his twisted inner conflict revolves around the bitterness he nurses for his professional rivals. On the level of the real, his malevolent gaze is the perverse expression of violent lust. But in the imaginary, he's simply a disconnected psyche hovering outside the human social circle, dying and killing to get in. There's plenty to suggest that Leopold's isolation is as much a function of mental illness as it is a function of a malicious project on society's part to make him a pariah. He shows signs of psychic disturbance. In turn, the movie avails itself of many simple tricks that make cinema a medium uniquely suited to render the psychotic state. We begin with Leopold in voiceover, backed up by the foghorn sounds of the deep.
Clarius Petrarchus.
The disembodied doctor recites, either reviewing or having learned by rote one of his marine biology reference books.
The walking catfish. Clarius has been equipped by nature to swim in water or walk on land. Clarius reproduce very rapidly and spawn through much of the year.
It's almost criminally easy in film to simulate the sub-auditory voices schizophrenics often report hearing. Cinema abounds in examples of voiceover narration used to mimic the overactive inner monologues of the mad. Consider Norman Bates' reverie on his decision to spare a common housefly in Psycho. But there's something additional at work here. Yes, Leopold runs through the usual mad monster variety fare, mocking his fellow scientists for their short-sightedness, and taking victory laps whenever he kills one of them, and can mark another face off his hit list. These lapses into straight textbook readings, though, are genuinely eerie. It's as though the dispassionate, objective voice of science itself had gone mad. The mere cataloging of facts and statistics had become a profane, satanic art. Crazy Dr. Leopold's off-camera ranting finds its foil in the voice the in-pit couple uses to finger him as the killer. When in need of certain germane information, Clarius's habitat and behaviors, for instance, or particulars on the facility that operated here in World War II, they read their queries robotically into the secured radio device, one that looks suspiciously like an oscilloscope. A remote operator with a German accent soon comes back with the answer. Is this voice meant to be human? Does he sound like an automaton only because he approaches his job with dry professionalism? Or is it instead maybe a computer masquerading as human?
Results of salinity imbalance tests. And the computer readout on the history of marine mutations. Over.
I've received your input, Mobile 7. A request for information. Radioactive data, Florida, United States, freshwater sources. Result of salinity imbalance. History of marine mutation computer readout. Over.
If it's the former, the operator is probably wondering the same thing about the in-pit couple. If it's the latter, that would explain the speed with which the computer retrieves the requested information. The dispassionate wording of the operator's responses mirrors the deadpan mode of his delivery, as though, like Leopold in voiceover, he were cribbing his material straight from a textbook. Supposing the operator is a computer, it has no inclination to change the wording or improvise. Supposing he's human, he doesn't have time. Information retrieval has gotten far more efficient than it was in Leopold's mid-century heyday, but it's still cumbersome. Few data are stored on magnetic tape or punch card. Mostly facts and figures must still be pulled off shelves or looked up in binders, and either read aloud or transcribed onto another physical medium before it can be transferred. Information's a bulky thing, and one can feel its weight in the burned German voice, its bare repetition of naked fact. 9 years since the space war, about 1,000 computers around the country now have screen monitors. A high-priority outfit charged with a vital mission in pit would surely be in this exclusive club, which means they are almost likely referencing at least some of their information via command line interface. That brisk exchange mimicking spoken conversation. Searches are easy on command line interfaces, at least compared to using card catalogs or bound references. The robotic voice coughs up the answers quickly, enough for them to be of value to the in-pit couple. But there's still little time for banter or expression, affirmation, or even confirmation of their shared, presumably human, reality. Here, the in-pit couple resemble Leopold in the classic way heroes often mimic villains. To wit, they're all in danger of having their sentience swallowed up in information and technology. The protagonists indicate this in their blank exchanges with the computer operator, exchanges in which the apparatus and the information conspire to deprive communication of all subjectivity. For his part, Leopold interacts at great length with the array of customized electronic consoles in his lab. These are his principal companions. He's so absorbed into his gizmocracy as to be barely human at all, and in fact becoming other than human is his express task.
The post-war period has seen a curious connection grow between the United States, particularly California, and Japan. A colonization realized as an investment partnership. It's inequitable, to be sure. Interactions between winner and loser differ more in magnitude than in kind from one war to the next. It's also, though, a relationship with characteristics of symbiosis. There is, first of all, a physical resemblance. Both Japan and California are narrow geographic features, and they span more latitude than longitude. This generally indicates a greater variety of harvests and less yield in each one, which over time results in a more diverse economy. The two regions, the island of Japan and the state of California, also share a vulnerability to calamitous seismic events, a likeness less often commented on before the war. This is no coincidence. Though far apart, the two entities, nation and state, share the vast and volatile continental plates of the Pacific, the Ring of Fire. In 1971, this new kinship seems to be felt through the Earth itself. In early February, an earthquake rocks greater Los Angeles. Though relatively weak, it nevertheless kills more than 60 due to the density of the area struck and the fragility of some of the buildings there. Japan has recently suffered similar quakes. 2 in 1969 killed 52 and injured many more between them. That summer, Japan, which also shares with California an economically vibrant film industry, treats school kids to Gamera versus Zigra episodes K07 and 316, a big monster pot boiler where aliens use directed earthquakes to subjugate humanity. It's worth mentioning that 2 days after the theatrical release of this latest entry in the Kaiju Eiga franchise, a prolonged cinematic testament to the horror of toppled downtown high-rises, the U.S. finishes construction of the South Tower of the World Trade Center, which then officially becomes the tallest building in the world, where the denizens of the Pacific coast fear their ocean's monsters. Those of the Atlantic taunt theirs with ever more tempting targets. Japanese filmmakers also share with their American counterparts a taste for hyperbole. The film opens with a Peruvian earthquake, evidently of natural origin, that measures 13 on a scale that's never explicitly specified, but presumed to be the same the Japanese use in real life. Methods for measuring earthquake intensity vary widely, are peculiar to people accustomed to linear measures like those for distance and temperature, and change over time, but they typically yield figures in the single digits. Once the aliens make themselves known, they increase their leverage with progressively stronger quakes until one measures an unfathomable 18 on this same semi-fictional scale. Think here in a roundabout way of the literal form of hyperbolic science fiction, really more paranormal fantasy seen in Bridey Murphy, which simply takes an existing metric and exaggerates it. To wit, if hypnosis can regress its subject to childhood, the paranormal version of hypnosis can take us back to past lives. If an earthquake of magnitude 8 can be imagined, a fantastic earthquake of magnitude 18 can occur as well. Simply turn the metric up. Taking yet another cue from the Americans, who just recently promoted the all-new jumbo jet in airport, Gamera vs. Zigra is, among other things, a cross-market media campaign for the Kamigawa Aquatic Zoo. Modeled after San Diego's SeaWorld amusement park, Kamigawa opened the year before. Zigra's young stars, Marjorie, Helen, and Kenny, are infatuated with the local park, a weakness their mother uses as leverage to get them to brush their teeth before going off to school.
The SeaWorld animals do it a lot better than you.
She chastises them. Even the killer whales rinse their mouths. It's a bit of an odd parallel to draw for the presumably quietly despairing stay-at-home mother, since these apex predators devour their prey while it's still alive. This morning parenting procedural is intercut with establishing shots of Kamigawa, first the front gate and then the pool stadium, where Dad is putting the killer whales through their paces for the show. The alibi for this editing is that it establishes the three children's father's employment at Kamigawa, but it has a curious effect nevertheless. The children seem to be dreaming of the aquarium sea creatures, while their mother explicitly asks them to imagine being in the creature's place. In the wake of the 18-point earthquake, we learn the children are, if not the bosses, then certainly the ones in the know. When their tiny boat is beamed into the Zigran UFO and they first confront the shapely alien woman who threatens their planet, they consistently outdo their adult charges in terms of grasping what's going on.
And she has super celestial powers,
one of them affirms when setting eyes on her.
I knew it too. I bet she can even do magic.
The adults, meantime, are still trying to get a handle on what's happening. They're struggling with the disorientation that comes from being hauled bodily out of the sea and brusquely dropped into an alien command center. The teleport mechanism the Zigrans use to tow physical matter into their spacecraft requires that living things be zapped into a soporific state before they're moved. So the family is awakened in the UFO's command room as though from a dreamless sleep. The children are perhaps more accustomed to moving back and forth between the sleep and waking states. The sequence in the movie's prologue would suggest so.
Children grasp things much faster than adults. Their innocence makes them see things clearly.
We've encountered this conceit of the child empath several times already, both in Japanese matinee science fiction movies and in their American counterparts, viz. Invaders from Mars and Space Children. But the point's rarely made so overtly as here. The children twice reveal themselves to be stowaways. This, as Mel Bakersfield recently explained, is a role humanity has played since the Egyptians first navigated the Red Sea. The incident comes when they stash themselves under some gear aboard the boat their biologist fathers used to approach the mysterious flying saucer. The stowaways' shiftless distance from the open channels of maritime commerce is what enables their greater insights into unfamiliar or alien realities. And this is true of children's mischief in general. The stowaway also is the conduit by which alien knowledge is initially transmitted to quotidian consciousness. Thus, Helen and Kinney must translate the aliens' pronouncements for Tom and Henry, who've arrived legitimately and with certified subject matter expertise to boot, and yet have no idea what's going on. Living everyday reality and conducting oneself by society's rules leave one ill-equipped to comprehend novel experiences. To grasp the alien, it helps to be a bit alien oneself. Once news of the invasion finally sinks into Tom and Henry's square grown-up skulls, the Zigran marauders broadcast their demands to the balance of humanity by hijacking our television sets. "All you people of the earth," the alien proclaims, "I shall cause the greatest earthquake the world has ever witnessed." The eloquence of her oratory is such that she really doesn't need visual accompaniment, so the Zigrans don't bother to take over the screens except to screw them over into a wildly unbalanced horizontal hold. Japan's terrified citizenry surround them as they, not too long before, encircled their radios, awaiting bulletins. They gaze at these vacant screens rather than each other. It's easy to think of scrambled horizontal hold as being essentially the same as static, but static is the absence of a signal. TVs with wobbling horizontal holds are broadcasting a signal, and are at least as likely to be broadcasting a motion picture signal as a TV with an aligned horizontal hold is. Because of the distortion, the picture is indecipherable to the conscious mind. To what extent the subconscious metabolizes these warped images, though, who can say? 1971 brings us A Touch of Satan, episode 908, latest in a string of Rosemary's Baby knockoffs, which opens as itinerant youngster Jody Lee Thompson motors his Ford Maverick to San Francisco to scratch some itch the movie doesn't ever disclose. We're given Jody's voyage not so much through him as through his car, which is blankly filmed in a series of extreme long shots as it mellowly traverses the highways of the American Southwest. We get the occasional take on handsome Jody at the wheel, his fresh young face beaming with possibilities, but mostly we just see the car. In the first few minutes, Jody makes two key decisions, though he doesn't know he's making them. And in both instances, from a storytelling point of view, this is blocked through his Maverick. The first comes when he encounters the terrible place's gatekeeper. This role is filled by the eccentric gas station attendant refueling Jody's car, who warns him about a spate of local murders the police seem unable to solve. The decision Jody makes is to largely dismiss this omen. His Maverick's the only thing in sight when this leads to his second decision, which is to turn off the roadway down a set of dirt tracks to a pond, one scarcely a mile from the gas station. The single act, more than any other, seals his fate, though again neither he nor we know this, and yet he commits it in hiding, his face no more visible than a suited astronaut's. This is because he later happens on comely farm girl Melissa Strickland, passing the idle time farmhands get so little of by strolling around the pond. She strikes up a halting conversation with Jody, and before long he's having lunch back at the Strickland place. Melissa's unctuous dad, who's been working the field, offers Jody a snort of homemade cider as a peace offering. The way he speaks of it and the way a sheriff's deputy speaks of it later, one suspects it may have a bit more zing to it than is typical in ciders. Most of us learn that at an early age that the secret ingredient in homemade alcoholic concoctions is usually more alcohol. All this time, we in the theater already know that the town killer is sleeping at the Strickland home. And so, of course, do the Stricklands. So we fear for Jody's safety. Or at least the filmmakers would like us to. The subtext of urban-rural class tension does more than form the alibi for the underlying, more visceral concern that Jody might be murdered, though. His father, a lawyer, has financed his voyage of discovery, giving him $300 in use of the Maverick to help him undertake it. This could well stoke Miss Strickland's envy. Like Jody, Melissa has little apparent interest in carrying on the family's practice. She mostly dawdles around the house, watching her caretakers get the chores done. But unlike Jody, she doesn't have the option of picking up and leaving. The tepid romance that later evolves between the two is given us superficially as a happenstance of the sort that so fascinates younglings in love. But the possibility that she has summoned or captivated him through witchcraft is never far from the surface.
Funny, isn't it?
Jody says as they coo and fondle at the pond.
I wonder what causes a thing like that.
If Melissa truly has used the dark arts to bedazzle Jody, lust for revenge could be her motivation just as easily as envy. If she can't go on a voyage of self-discovery like Jody's, then at least she can deprive him of the privilege, trap him, drag him down with her, screaming. We soon learn the Strickland's principal secret, which is that Melissa's visibly aged, murderous grandmother, the fromicidal maniac Jody was so fruitlessly warned about, is in fact her preternaturally elderly sister. They have both been provisionally granted unending life as part of a deal with the devil. Actually, the entity prefers to be known as Mormo or Gorgo. This deal was struck a century ago to save Melissa's sister from being burned at the stake as a witch. Melissa is thus trapped in a provisional immortality. She cannot leave the farm, and she cannot ever die. In truth, she has every reason to envy Jody. Any sane person would. But if she does, she keeps it well under wraps. This goes on until the new couple stumbles on Grandma's sister Lucinda, disemboweling the local deputy with a meat hook. There now being no way of keeping their secret from Jody, the Stricklands take him into protective custody. Against this shifting backdrop, Melissa's continuing kind demeanor toward Jody starts to resemble not a lover's sweet nothings, but a judiciously deployed act of kindness like those the Chinese military used against American POWs not so long before. Her motivation, a tricky read throughout, becomes thoroughly inscrutable. Is she genuinely taken with him? Does she want to punish him because she covets the freedom his social class, sex, and circumstance afford him? Or is she keeping him around to help release her from her satanic pact? The third possibility comports with the first two, which is to say that, for instance, Melissa could genuinely love Jody and still use him as a means to the end of gaining freedom. Overall, though, Melissa is a shady character, as those who've sold their souls to the devil tend to be, and Jody would be well advised to hold her at a safe distance. For the record, he doesn't. Like a prospective customer who keeps telling the salesman how fat his wallet is, Jody repeatedly reaffirms his affections, vowing to stand by her through any and all obstacles. This leads to an interesting question regarding how exactly the shadow of witchcraft came to fall on the Strickland home. Melissa earlier avers to having put a hex on Jody, a comment that strikes him as offhand at the time. Knowing she's a witch, we in the audience are more likely to take her at her word. By the time Jody's in handcuffs in Melissa's shack, he's learned about her background as well. Thus, he would have good reason to believe Melissa was likely forthright earlier in her seemingly joking confession, if only he'd take a moment to think back. Is Melissa a witch in this sense, as in one who casts hexes and brews hypnotizing potions? It's a mystery. In the same earlier scene, she tells Jody she's the sort of witch who makes everything look the way it looks. This claim is so reflexive as to verge on being meaningless. Who's to say why things look the way they look as opposed to another way? But it inclines one to think Melissa is more of a New Age witch, one who burns incense and reads tarot, but has no tangible supernatural powers. In the flashback that transitions into the third act, at 19th century, Melissa channels the devil's power through her outstretched hand to extinguish the flames lapping at her sister, thereby saving Lucinda's life. Strictly speaking, this isn't Melissa's doing. The devil's working his will through her. So we must consider the possibility that she may be a third kind of witch, one whose only true supernatural leverage is the ability to commune with more powerful evil spirits.
Put out the fire,
says Mormo, who in reality is only Melissa's own voice, schizophrenically overdubbed into her head, by the way. And Melissa somehow smothers the flames from 50 feet simply by flexing her outstretched fingers at them. This seems like a simple imperative, but it's more complicated than that. Gorgo isn't just issuing an order. Maybe he's affirming for Melissa that she's up to the task, the way a spoken word hypnotherapy LP might help you quit smoking by telling you to put out that cigarette. The solipsistic ideas in cybernetics have had 20 years to sink in, after all. It's popular to think you in effect the impossible simply by believing in yourself. In any case, there's a lot of this self-referential talk throughout. Mining the same cultural vein that will lead this year to the Est movement, Melissa and Jody frequently affirm an exceptional degree of control over their immediate physical reality.
You really do believe there's some devil out there?
Jody tells Melissa.
I suppose that makes it true.
All this resonates with the popular conviction that reality is first created in the mind and heart before being forged in the physical realm.
You turned down a road yesterday because you wanted to see what was at the other end.
Melissa tells Jody.
Well, now you've seen it, but you won't believe it.
She's referring here to their earlier conversation about the happenstance of love, Jody's chance decision to drive to the pond where they first met. Essentially, Melissa's just looking here for more ways to hector Jody into a more credulous posture. On another level, though, her and Jody's reflexivity masks a more complicated epistemological question. What does it mean to attribute Jody and Melissa's love to Jody's arbitrary decision to turn down that less traveled road? It's a truism, yes. No shit, the couple met due to a series of circumstances that led to their meeting. But on a fantastic level, it makes Jody into a variety of intangible witch, or in this case, warlock as well. Is it not he, rather than she, who cast the hex when he decided to turn down that road? This possibility is fully realized at the movie's conclusion. Jody, called to action after the devil lifts his hand of protection from Melissa and she ages right before his eyes, follows her down the dark path by appealing to the same Gorgo entity to restore her ill-gotten youth. We go through the same routine. He stretches an arm skyward. Now, why would Morgo be found in that direction? Then holds it before him, playing his fingers in the air as if trying to close his distance from the woman he's hoping to save. They're both vessels of the devil now, and the movie, having no further trajectory to follow save descent into evil, ends. This is a touch of Satan's sole moment of clarity on the subject of what it means to be a witch, though, which only reminds us of how mercurial these proceedings have been up to now. Aside from wondering what sort of witch Melissa is, we're also confronted with the question of exactly when Melissa becomes a witch to begin with. In the frontier flashback, roiled townspeople set on young Melissa and Lucinda, along with her biological father, accusing the family of causing their crops to fail and their children to be stillborn. Lucinda's ordeal and Melissa's pact with Gorgo follow. But if this is the moment Melissa becomes a witch, what about the failed crops and stillbirths? If Melissa was already casting hexes before hearing the voice of Mormo, then her pact is essentially irrelevant, extraneous. If, on the other hand, the hexes were a fit of imagination among the townspeople, then the whole affair becomes an exercise in making the horror real by imagining it. The same peculiar conceit we saw more than a decade earlier in The She-Creature. Earlier, when Melissa is pulling every trick she can think of to convince Jody of her supernatural pedigree, she even tries reaching into his mind.
It happened, Jody, just like in your dream,
she assures him, insinuating that she can see his innermost thoughts.
Is it a coincidence that I know they sang a hymn in your dream?
When she hums Amazing Grace, Jody's left dumbfounded. This song does indeed resound as a theme of his most recent nightmare. By odd coincidence, the idea that dreams can be used to make determinations of fact has been getting a lot of attention in other related circles. John Mack's Nightmares and Human Conflict, a pop psychology meditation released last year, also talks about this practice of taking bad dreams as literal, linking it to regressive societies. To do so, he tells a story with its origins in the witch hunts of medieval Europe. The demons that visit one's dreams may or may not be real, this philosophy goes. That's not important. What matters is how vigorously the dreamer resists them. To be deemed too conciliatory in one's interactions with dream demons was, as with so many other things, to risk accusations of witchcraft. Consider the relationship this surely established between the medieval vassal subject and the religious authority presiding over her. The church's long arm could reach directly into her mind's unbidden images and extract her condemnation. Her thoughts, not only those she willed, but those visited on her from the unaccountable recesses of her psyche, were under the purview of institutional authority and could bring her harm. A Touch of Satan is a curious amalgam of quite a few related contemporary cultural touchstones, each one being altered in sometimes creative ways. There are shades of the Tate LaBianca killings. The aged Lucinda puts just as much elbow grease into gutting the town's unlucky deputy as any death to pigs chanting Manson Disciple. Then there's the movie's inevitable debt to Rosemary's Baby, which has already spawned scores of imitators in the handful of years since its release. This invites the curious and possibly distasteful question of whether any causative relationship exists between Rosemary's Baby and its real-life counterpart. Sharon Tate was Roman Polanski's wife. Did Rosemary's Baby, or its lesser-known predecessor, the fearless vampire killers, replay over and over in Charles Manson's schizophrenic mind the way certain Beatles songs and popular media predictions of an incipient race war did? It's astonishingly seldom mentioned that Polanski's child was lost in a bizarre ritual so soon after the father had directed a movie in which an evil child is born under similar circumstances. Perhaps his proximity in time is part of the reason, that and the grotesque insinuations that arise naturally from the idea's mere contemplation. It's still too soon. Maybe it always will be. Another inevitable comparison here, as usual, is to the Clutter murders. Though A Touch of Satan reverses the heroes and villains, it retains this earlier story's essential element of serial violence being exacted on a farming community. As the flesh-grinding war in agrarian Indochina drags on, the film industry has fallen into a bit of a funk, so that along with the frightening Rosemary's Baby, They've also peddled us bloodbaths like The Wild Bunch and this year's A Clockwork Orange and Straw Dogs. One of the seminal instances in the studio's spree-killing spree is the 1967 cinema adaptation of In Cold Blood, which overlays a haunted quality on Capote's courthouse procedural. The dread with which director Richard Brooks infuses the film indicates an acknowledgement on his part of how grave these crimes were. Still, there's something disconcerting about turning a real-life mass killing into a money-making pop culture product. If one believes in ghosts, how easily one might imagine the Clutters' spirits circling restlessly over the Brooks' home or the box offices where the profits from their murder were gathered. In almost perfect contrast to the Clutters, the Stricklands are caretakers rather than targets of their murderous impulse.
Mother?
None are killers by nature. Even Lucinda practices devotion in her earlier years. She and her family are studying Bible verse when the angry mob arrives to burn her, and is only driven to rage by satanic influence, jealousy, and the hideous burns she's scarred with. Indeed, the Stricklands in combination are needed to set the killing machines in motion. Even assuming the worst of Lucinda, without the orders to aid and abet her, cover up her crimes, and incite her jealousies in the first place, she either would have never started taking lives or been swiftly arrested if she had. Prerequisite to the creation of the long-standing criminal conspiracy, the system of impulsive act and reluctant cover-up the Stricklands have been maintaining for at least the past few decades. They must first function as a unit. This makes them more like the felonious duo from In Cold Blood, who are mere malcontents and drifters individually, but in combination become a malevolent and lethal force. This process of social organization, not that of fragmenting isolation, is what paves the path to violence and, in turn, the unraveling of culture. As of this year, Don Henderson and James McClarty, the director and screenwriter behind A Touch of Satan, have only 2 other films to their credit. Both are variations on the well-worn theme of the wealthy, middle-aged professional man driven by marital dissatisfaction into the arms of his family babysitter. Whereas Satan has a made-for-TV feel to it and enjoys one of the MPAA's first-ever PG ratings, Henderson and McClarty's earlier films are sleazy grindhouse affairs. Their subplots revolve around drug deals gone wrong, and they're peppered with gratuitous nudity, love scenes, and queasy sessions of sexualized torture and violence. But the Babysitter movies and A Touch of Satan share certain commonalities, too. Principal among them is a strangely delightful tendency toward reflexive thinking, self-referential narrative elements. In Weekend with the Babysitter, this is manifest in the conceit by which well-to-do screenwriter-producer Jim Carlton and his sitter first get romantically entangled. His distant, angry wife having gone to spend a few days with some friends, he has Candy over, who then starts idly thumbing through one of his scripts and cringes on reading the stilted dialogue meant to represent the style of the younger generation. "You really turned me on. We should make the scene together sometime." "Nobody talks that way," she admonishes him, and after some to and fro, they sojourn to a nearby bar to hang out with their friends so she can learn about his subject firsthand. This anthropological bridging of generations looks a bit like Sutwell's in Beach Party, with the added reflexive element of the screenplay stirred in. There are all sorts of opportunities for play within a play, flights of narrative fancy, and formal exploration of the cinematic medium. But instead, Weekend with the Babysitter just circles back in on itself. Candy's hippie cadre speak much the way the characters in Jim's script do, and though they initiate him into some of the more superficial rituals of the teenage generation, they give him a joint and teach him how to ride a motorcycle. They ride Hondas, incidentally. Their bland ringleader, Snitch, offers no particular insight into the human or social condition. If the collective does guard any of the secrets that elude the pages of Jim's script, they do this so effectively that he and we are never made privy to them. Another contrast cum likeness between A Touch of Satan and the Babysitter Saga is that in the earlier movies, the male figure is the one contending with the ravages of age, whereas in Satan, this role falls to a woman. In either case, it's easy to call attention to the prurient sexism in the narrative arcs Henderson and McClarty have concocted. That's certainly there. The torture and confession scene that concludes their debut grindhouse picture of the babysitter is particularly grueling. Its grimy look and rushed performances only making it all the more nauseous. But there's something more universal at work here, too. Henderson and McClarty's heroine, Melissa, like their heroes, harbors a visceral loathing of age and death, this being the same aversion we all mostly share. Age affects women differently and inflicts more punitive social consequences on them, but it afflicts us all and will ultimately claim us all. Henderson and McClarty's trademark reflexivity reminds us there's really not much more we can say on that subject.
Platinum Plus, the blade with an edge of Gillette's astonishing new platinum alloy. Platinum Plus, harder than stainless, more durable than chrome, to shave you not just cleaner, but with more comfort than any blade in history. Gillette Platinum Plus, the blade you've always wanted, and more.